The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Corporal Thomas Hartwell adjusted his ceremonial sword and took his position at the Henry VIII Gate. At 28, he had served with the Coldstream Guards for 7 years, including 2 deployments in Iraq where he had earned a military cross for exceptional bravery under fire. His selection for ceremonial duties at Windsor was both an honor and recognition of his exemplary service record. The tourists were already gathering despite the early hour, their cameras ready to capture the famous red-coated guards who had protected British royalty for centuries. Among them was a group of American visitors on their first trip to England, a family from Japan studying the architecture, and several local history enthusiasts who never tired of witnessing these living symbols of British tradition. But watching, from across the courtyard, was someone whose presence would soon shatter the peaceful morning atmosphere. Trevor Kane, 42-year-old former soldier who had been discharged from the Army 15 years earlier under less than honorable circumstances, stood behind a stone pillar with something concealed beneath his long coat. His bloodshot eyes and unkempt appearance suggested a man whose life had taken a dark turn since his military service ended. Trevor's military career had been promising initially, but it was cut short when he was caught stealing equipment and selling it to civilians. The court-martial and dishonorable discharge had destroyed his prospects for legitimate employment, and his descent into alcoholism and petty crime had been swift and devastating. Now, consumed by resentment and seeking someone to blame for his failures, he had fixated on the ceremonial guards as symbols of everything he believed he had been denied. Thomas stood motionless at his post, his trained eyes scanning the crowd. While maintaining the stoic expression required by ceremonial protocol, his Lee-Enfield rifle was unloaded according to regulations. But his ceremonial sword was very real, steel blade honed to razor sharpness and maintained according to centuries-old traditions. Few tourists realized that these weapons, while ceremonial in function, remained fully functional implements of war. The morning sun began to burn away the mist, revealing the full splendor of the castle's architecture and the precise positioning of the guards at their various posts. The ceremony was proceeding normally, with tourists maintaining respectful distances while capturing photographs and videos of the impressive display of military tradition. Trevor's hand tightened around the handle of the woodsman's axe hidden beneath his coat. He had stolen it from a construction site 2 days earlier, driven by a half-formed plan to humiliate one of the guards and prove that their ceremonial duties made them soft and vulnerable. In his alcohol-impaired reasoning, attacking a guard would somehow vindicate his own military failures and expose what he saw as the hollow pageantry of their duties. Thomas's peripheral vision caught movement that didn't fit the normal patterns of tourist behavior. A man was moving against the flow of the crowd, his posture tense and purposeful in a way that triggered the combat veteran's instincts. Years of military service had taught him to recognize potential threats, even in seemingly peaceful environments. The crowd continued their activities, unaware that among them moved someone whose intentions went far beyond sightseeing or photography. Children pointed excitedly at the guards while parents explained the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Tour guides shared stories about the castle's 800-year history, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would become part of that ongoing story. Trevor began his approach toward Thomas's position, his coat billowing slightly with each step to reveal glimpses of the weapon concealed beneath. His movements became more erratic as he drew closer, the alcohol and rage combining to override whatever rational thought might have remained in his troubled mind. The morning that had begun so peacefully, with mist and tourists and ceremonial precision, was about to transform into something far more dangerous. Ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of conflict were about to see violence once again. But this time, the outcome would depend on the skills and training of a modern soldier wearing the uniform of ages past. Trevor's erratic approach drew increasingly concerned glances from tourists, who sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite identify the source of their unease. His muttering became audible as he closed the distance to Thomas's ceremonial position, his words a mixture of military terminology and bitter complaints about unfairness and betrayal. "Look at him," Trevor slurred to no one in particular, gesturing toward Thomas with his free hand while keeping the axe concealed. "Standing there like he's something special, like he's better than the rest of us who served." An elderly British couple exchanged worried looks and began moving their grandchildren away from the area. A tour guide noticed the disruption and started speaking more loudly to distract his group from the increasingly agitated individual. But several tourists had already begun recording with their phones. Initially thinking they might capture an interesting interaction, Thomas maintained his ceremonial stance, but his combat-trained senses were now fully alert. The approaching man's military bearing was evident despite his disheveled appearance, and his behavior exhibited all the warning signs of someone operating under severe psychological distress. The guard's hand remained properly positioned on his rifle, but his mind was rapidly calculating distances, angles, and potential responses to whatever was developing. The castle's security personnel had also noticed the disturbance, several plainclothes officers beginning to converge on the area from different directions. But their positions around the vast courtyard meant they would need crucial minutes to reach Thomas's location, during which the guardsman would need to handle the situation, according to his training and judgment. Trevor's coat fell open as his agitation increased, revealing the woodsman's axe strapped to his belt. The sight of the weapon caused immediate panic among nearby tourists. With parents grabbing children and people beginning to run in various directions, screams echoed off the ancient castle walls as the peaceful morning ceremony transformed into a scene of terror and confusion. 15 years I've been nothing, Trevor shouted, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he pulled the axe from his belt. 15 years of watching people like you get respect while I get treated like garbage. The weapon was substantial and clearly designed for heavy work, a steel head weighing several pounds mounted on a hardwood handle nearly 3 feet long. In the hands of a desperate and intoxicated former soldier, it represented a deadly threat to everyone in the immediate area. Thomas's response was immediate and professional. His years of combat experience and ceremonial training merged as he assessed the threat level and available options. The crowd's safety was paramount, but his position and equipment limited his choices for response. His unloaded rifle was ceremonial at this moment, but his sword remained a fully functional weapon. "Sir, you need to put down the weapon and step back," Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. There are civilians in the area who could be hurt. But Trevor was beyond reason, his anger and alcohol consumption having pushed him past the point where rational appeals could reach him. The axe felt heavy and reassuring in his hands. He saw the guard not as a fellow veteran deserving respect, but as a symbol of everything he blamed for his failures. The remaining tourists scattered in all directions, their holiday photos forgotten. In favor of personal safety, castle staff began implementing emergency protocols, while security personnel rushed toward the scene with growing urgency. But the physics of distance and time meant that for the next crucial minutes, Thomas would face this threat alone. Trevor raised the axe above his head and charged toward the guard's position. His military training still evident in his movements despite years of deterioration. The attack was committed and potentially lethal, aimed at someone who represented everything he felt had been denied to him in his post-military life. But Thomas Hartwell was no ceremonial figure playing dress-up for tourists. Veteran with multiple deployments and commendations for valor, wearing a uniform that represented centuries of military excellence and trained in techniques that had been refined through generations of warfare. The moment Trevor began his charge with the raised axe, Thomas's military training took complete control. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy the formal constraints of ceremonial duty, he drew his ceremonial sword from its scabbard, the steel blade singing as it cleared the sheath. The weapon that tourists assumed was merely decorative revealed itself to be a perfectly balanced instrument of war. Trevor's axe swing was powerful but clumsy, driven more by rage than skill. His 15 years away from military discipline had eroded whatever combat techniques he might once have possessed, while alcohol further impaired his coordination and judgment. The attack was telegraphed and slow compared to the threats Thomas had faced in actual combat zones. Thomas sidestepped the wild swing with practiced ease, his movements economical and precise. The axe blade passed harmlessly through empty air, while the guard's sword moved in a defensive arc that demonstrated years of training in both ceremonial drill and practical swordsmanship. The steel caught the morning sunlight as it moved, creating a flash that seemed to symbolize the deadly seriousness beneath ceremonial tradition. The crowd that had scattered was now watching from safer distances, their phones capturing footage that would later go viral across social media platforms. But what they recorded was not the massacre that Trevor had intended. Instead, they witnessed a masterclass in professional military response under extreme circumstances. Trevor's momentum carried him past Thomas's position, his failed attack leaving him off balance and vulnerable. The guard could have ended the confrontation immediately with a lethal strike, but his training emphasized proportional response and preservation of life whenever possible. Instead of attacking, he maintained a defensive position while calling out commands in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "Drop your weapon now," Thomas commanded, his sword held in a guard position that would allow him to deflect another attack while keeping the blade ready for offensive action, if necessary. "This is your final warning, before I respond with lethal force." Castle security. Personnel were now close enough to see the confrontation clearly, but they held their positions rather than interfere with the guards' handling of the situation. Thomas was the trained expert in close combat, and their intervention might disrupt his tactical advantage or endanger civilian bystanders, who were still in the area. Trevor spun around to face the guard again, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. At having missed his target so completely, the axe felt heavier in his hands now, and he was beginning to realize that his opponent was not the ceremonial decoration he had assumed. The sword in Thomas's hands was held with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "You think you're better than me?" Trevor screamed, raising the axe for another attack. "We both wore the uniform. We both served. But you get to stand here playing dress-up while I've got nothing?" Thomas's response revealed both his tactical expertise and his understanding of human nature. "You're right. We both served," he said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "But service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It continues in how you treat other people and how you handle the hard times." The words seemed to penetrate Trevor's alcoholic haze for a moment, but his grip on the axe remained firm. He was committed to his course of action now, driven by years of resentment and the chemical courage of morning drinking. The confrontation would continue until one of them was unable to fight. But what Trevor failed to understand was that he was not facing a tourist attraction or ceremonial performer. He was confronting a professional soldier whose sword was not a prop, but a weapon, maintained according to military standards and wielded by someone who had proven his courage under fire in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed countless conflicts over 8 centuries. But few had featured such a stark contrast between professional military skill and amateur desperation played out before an audience of horrified tourists with recording devices. Trevor launched his second attack with desperate fury, swinging the axe in a wide horizontal arc aimed at Thomas's midsection. But where his first attempt had been poorly planned, this one was even more predictable, telegraphed by his stance and the obvious wind-up of his swing. Thomas responded with the fluid precision of classical swordsmanship combined with modern military tactics. He stepped forward into Trevor's attack rather than away from it, closing the distance before the axe could build momentum. His sword moved in a defensive parry that deflected the axe blade while simultaneously positioning him for a counterattack. The clash of steel on steel rang across the courtyard like a bell, the sound sharp and metallic against the ancient stone walls. Tourists who had never witnessed real combat were stunned by the speed and violence of the exchange. While their cameras continued recording what was becoming a textbook demonstration of professional military skill, Trevor's axe was knocked aside by the parry, leaving him completely exposed and off balance once again. Thomas's sword was now in perfect position for a killing stroke, and his combat experience in Iraq had taught him not to hesitate when facing a deadly threat. But instead of delivering a fatal blow, he executed a precise strike with the flat of his blade against Trevor's wrist. The impact was perfectly calculated. Hard enough to cause Trevor to drop the axe, but not severe enough to cause permanent injury. The weapon clattered to the stone courtyard as Trevor clutched his numbed hand, his face a mixture of pain, shock, and dawning realization that he was completely outmatched. Castle security. Personnel moved in quickly now that the immediate threat had been neutralized, their movements coordinated and professional. But they approached with clear respect for Thomas's handling of the situation. Recognizing that his restraint and skill had prevented what could have been a much more tragic outcome, Thomas maintained his guard position with the sword until security had Trevor under control, then slowly returned the blade to its scabbard with the same ceremonial precision he had demonstrated in drawing it. The weapon disappeared back into what tourists assumed was merely decorative equipment, but everyone present now understood the deadly reality beneath the pageantry. Medical attention for both individuals, Thomas called out to the security team, his voice returning to the calm professionalism expected of ceremonial duties. The suspect appears to have a wrist injury and possible alcohol poisoning. I'm uninjured, but should be examined as per protocol. Trevor was now sitting on the ground, cradling his injured wrist while security personnel secured the scene. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by the hollow recognition that his plan had failed spectacularly and that he was now facing serious criminal charges for attacking a member of the Queen's Guard. The crowd of tourists began to cautiously return, their phones capturing the aftermath of what many were already calling the most dramatic thing they had ever witnessed. Social media posts were beginning to appear with hashtags about the sword-fighting guard at Windsor Castle, though few of the initial reports captured the full complexity of what had actually occurred. Inspector Sarah Collins, the senior security officer who had coordinated the response, approached Thomas with a mixture of professional admiration and personal concern. She had witnessed many incidents during her career at various royal residences, but nothing quite like the demonstration of controlled lethality she had just observed. "Guardsman Hartwell," she said formally, "that was exceptional handling of an extremely dangerous situation. Your restraint in using non-lethal force when you clearly had the option for more decisive action will be noted in my report." Thomas nodded acknowledgement, but his attention remained focused on Trevor, who was now receiving medical attention from paramedics. The former soldier's eyes met his briefly, and Thomas saw something there that went beyond defeat, a recognition of what might have been, and what had been lost through choices and circumstances that had led to this moment. The mourning ceremony would continue after the scene was cleared and statements were taken. But the incident would become part of Windsor Castle's modern history, demonstrating that the ceremonial guards remained very much real soldiers, capable of defending themselves and others when circumstances demanded it. 3 hours after the confrontation, Thomas sat in the castle's security office providing his detailed statement of the incident. The small room was equipped with recording equipment and monitoring systems, but the atmosphere was more debriefing than interrogation. Inspector Collins had made it clear that his actions were being reviewed as a matter of protocol rather than suspicion of wrongdoing. The suspect's military background was evident in his initial approach and attack pattern, Thomas explained, his voice steady and professional. However, years of deterioration had significantly degraded whatever combat skills he might have once possessed. His movements were predictable and his tactical awareness was compromised by alcohol consumption. Meanwhile, in the castle's medical facility, Trevor was receiving treatment for his injured wrist while under guard by 2 security officers. The swelling had been reduced with ice and anti-inflammatory medication, and X-rays had confirmed that no bones were broken. The injury was precisely what Thomas had intended, painful enough to disable the weapon hand, but causing no permanent damage. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the duty physician, had also conducted blood tests that confirmed significant alcohol intoxication despite the early hour. Trevor's condition suggested he had been drinking heavily for several days, which explained both his impaired judgment and his deteriorated physical coordination during the attack. The incident had already attracted media attention, with news outlets requesting interviews and footage from tourists who had witnessed the confrontation. The castle's public relations department was coordinating responses while ensuring that security protocols and individual privacy were protected throughout the process. Thomas completed his statement and was cleared to return to duty. His commanding officer suggested he take the remainder of the day to process what had occurred. Combat veterans understood that even successful defensive actions could have psychological impacts that weren't immediately apparent. "I'd prefer to complete my scheduled duties, sir," Thomas replied when offered time off. Maintaining normal routines helps process these types of incidents, and the tourists who witnessed this morning's events deserve to see that we remain professional and capable. His request was approved, and Thomas returned to his ceremonial position at the Henry VIII Gate. Word of the incident had spread among the tourist groups. Visitors approached his post with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Asked if he was the guard who had fought off the axe attack, though protocol prevented him from discussing ongoing investigations in the medical facility. Trevor was gradually sobering up and beginning to comprehend the full extent of his situation. Inspector Collins arrived to conduct a formal interview, bringing with her a thick file containing his military service record and subsequent criminal history. Trevor Kane, age 42, formerly Lance Corporal Kane of the Royal Engineers. She read from his file. Dishonorably discharged 15 years ago following conviction for theft of military property. Multiple civilian arrests for public intoxication, assault, and petty theft since discharge. Trevor listened to his own history, being recited with growing shame and recognition of how far he had fallen since his military service ended. The contrast between his deteriorated state and the professional competence demonstrated by Thomas was stark and humbling. "The guard could have killed me," Trevor said quietly, flexing his injured wrist. He had every right to defend himself, with lethal force, but he chose not to. Why would he show mercy to someone who tried to hurt him? Inspector Collins had been wondering the same thing, having reviewed the security footage that clearly showed moments when Thomas could have delivered fatal strikes. The guard's restraint was remarkable given the deadly nature of the threat he had faced. The interview revealed the depth of Trevor's personal problems: unemployment, alcoholism, mounting debts, and social isolation that had created a perfect storm of resentment and desperation. His attack on Thomas had been the culmination of years of poor choices and missed opportunities for rehabilitation, but something in his demeanor had changed since the confrontation. The violent rage that had driven his assault had been replaced by a hollow recognition of his own failures and the professional excellence he had witnessed in his opponent. For the first time in years, he seemed to be seeing himself clearly rather than through the distorted lens of alcohol and self-pity. As evening approached, Castle returned to its normal rhythms of tourist activities and ceremonial duties. But the morning's events had left an invisible mark on everyone involved. From the guard, who had demonstrated exceptional skill and restraint, to the attacker, who had discovered that his target was far more formidable than anticipated. 2 years after the incident at Windsor Castle, Thomas Hartwell stood before a group of military academy cadets, using the confrontation as a case study in proportional response and tactical decision-making under pressure. The lecture hall was filled with future officers who listened intently as he described the split-second calculations that had guided his actions that morning. "The key principle," Thomas explained, pointing to tactical diagrams on the presentation screen, "is that superior skill creates options. When you're better trained and equipped than your opponent, you can choose your response based on the desired outcome, rather than simply reacting to the immediate threat." The viral video of the sword fight had been viewed millions of times, but Thomas used it now as an educational tool rather than a source of personal fame. Military training programs around the world had adopted his response as a textbook example of how ceremonial duties and combat readiness could coexist seamlessly. Meanwhile, Trevor Kane was completing his second year of sobriety while working as a counselor at a rehabilitation center in Manchester. His conviction for assault had resulted in a suspended sentence contingent on completing treatment and community service, but he had chosen to continue his recovery work long after fulfilling the legal requirements. The transformation had been gradual but profound. The man who had once attacked a guard with an axe now spent his days helping other veterans overcome the challenges that had nearly destroyed his own life. His personal experience with the consequences of violence and addiction gave him credibility with clients who might not trust conventional counselors. Thomas and Trevor had maintained an unlikely correspondence since the court proceedings concluded, exchanging letters about military service, personal responsibility, and the different paths that veterans could take after leaving active duty. Their relationship had evolved from victim and perpetrator to something more complex, to soldiers who had taken very different approaches to civilian life. "I think about that morning often," Trevor wrote in his latest letter. "Not because of the pain in my wrist, which healed months ago, but because of what you showed me about who I could have been if I had made better choices after my discharge." The Rehabilitation Center, where Trevor worked, specialized in helping veterans deal with addiction, unemployment, and the social isolation that often accompanied the transition to civilian life. His story had become part of the center's intake process, demonstrating both the consequences of poor choices and the possibility of redemption through sustained effort and support. Thomas had been promoted to sergeant and selected for advanced leadership training, but he continued to volunteer time at veteran support organizations. The incident at Windsor had made him acutely aware of how military skills and discipline could deteriorate without proper structure and community support. When Thomas finally accepted an invitation to visit Trevor's rehabilitation center, their meeting was observed by staff and clients who knew both men's stories. The handshake between them represented something unprecedented in the center's history, a face-to-face reconciliation between a crime victim and the perpetrator who had genuinely reformed his life. "Oh, you saved my life twice," Trevor said during their private conversation. "Once by not killing me when you had every justification, and again by showing me what professional dignity looks like. I needed to see the difference between the soldier I had been and the soldier I could have remained." Thomas nodded, recognizing the courage it had taken for Trevor to rebuild his life from such a low point. Military service teaches us about honor and sacrifice, but it doesn't automatically teach us how to handle failure or setbacks. You found your way back to those principles through your own effort. The Rehabilitation Center's walls displayed success stories from dozens of veterans who had overcome various challenges to rebuild meaningful lives. Trevor's story was among them, but it was unique in acknowledging both his failures and the role that Thomas's restraint had played in his eventual recovery. Their meeting was covered by local media as an example of restorative justice and veteran rehabilitation. But both men preferred to focus on the practical lessons their experience could provide to others facing similar struggles. The viral sword fight had become a teaching tool for multiple purposes: tactical training for military personnel and cautionary tale for veterans struggling with civilian life as Thomas prepared to leave the rehabilitation center. Him a framed photograph of their first meeting, not the violent confrontation captured by tourists, but a picture taken during his graduation from the counseling program. Both men were smiling, representing transformation and redemption that neither could have imagined during those violent moments at Windsor Castle. The ancient stones of the castle continued to witness daily ceremonies and tourist visits, but the morning when steel met steel in defense of principle had become part of its ongoing history, demonstrating that tradition and skill remained vibrant forces in modern times.